Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. Today's webinar episode is actually the second in a series titled The ABCs of CLC, CLC again standing for Cultural and Linguistic Competence. The first episode went over some common terms in cultural and linguistic competence trainings that oftentimes get mixed up. We titled that one This versus That. Today's webinar episode is going to focus on terminology that is important to have a good understanding of when engaging in further trainings about working with the Latino or the Hispanic community. So before we get started, just a couple of areas of information about this webinar series at large, as well as this particular episode that we want to make sure is clear. So the purpose of this webinar series is again to provide very basic and foundational clarification on common CLC or cultural linguistic competence terms in order to assist participants in better understanding more thorough topical presentations. So the goal of today's presentation is not so much about actual application, making changes in policies or procedures. We're not going to dig into the weeds to that level. It's really more, again, about the general terminology and vocabulary that is important to understand and important for folks to be on the same page about when getting into those more in-depth conversations later on down the road. So you are not going to come away from this training being quote-unquote culturally competent, which isn't possible from any training anyways, but certainly that's not the focus of this training. Oftentimes in cultural competence trainings or cultural responsiveness or cultural humility trainings, sometimes vocabulary can be introduced in the beginning of a training very quickly, and it's assumed to a certain extent that folks are talking about the same thing when we use words like race, or if we say something like Latino, it's just assumed that folks in the room understand exactly what those words mean. And sometimes that can cause some friction and some miscommunication later on when we really do get into the weeds. So that was kind of the inspiration for this whole entire webinar series. Uses of this series to either learn for the first time or get clarification for the first time or even review terminology. Another use of this webinar series is hopefully to inspire deeper learning. If you're hearing things for the first time or you find that you really didn't have a clear understanding on a certain concept before this one, hopefully after today's webinar, you won't just be satisfied with the level of information you're getting here, but that will actually inspire you to seek out further information, again, for that purpose of application, and really ensuring that you, in whatever role that you have, are doing an appropriate job providing culturally appropriate services within your service area. Today, perhaps even some red flags of your current level of knowledge may be raised. Please don't be overwhelmed by that or dismayed by that. Again, this is to encourage further learning if some of these concepts turn out to be very different than maybe what you had thought before. Now, before we get started digging into the specific vocabulary, I also want to put out some disclaimers just about language in general, vocabulary in general. Language changes, terminology changes, and the rate of change oftentimes is different at different levels. So sometimes words that were at one time thought to be appropriate in describing populations or concepts or conditions, today, current day, it's now understood that those words are no longer appropriate and are actually offensive. Sometimes the change over time in language isn't that extreme from appropriate to offensive, but can simply be that what is considered best practice could change over time. So even honestly, the term cultural competence is kind of starting to phase out as being the best practice term for this concept. You might hear cultural responsiveness or cultural humility more often to really get at that idea of we have to always continually be humble and learn from the individuals and families and communities we're interacting with about their cultural identity and not be ourselves as the know-all and be-all about the culture of a specific group. That's not to say that cultural competence is like a taboo bad word. Obviously, it's still a part of my job title, but it's starting to kind of phase out a little bit. Change in words also, like I mentioned before, is going to be different in different environments or amongst different institutions. Large entities, large institutions do not change in their terminology as quickly as like activist groups or grassroots movements that really are kind of more projecting out the wishes and desires of specific community groups. So you'll see, of course, those larger entities that are just these big boats that it takes a lot to be able to turn in their direction and in their terminology may lag behind. That's to be expected, just with what goes into changing language for a big institution like that. But to a certain point, it does sometimes get to be where enough is enough. And if you're still using terms that are offensive years after it is, common practice and best practice to use different terms, then of course we would expect our institutions to make that change. There could also potentially be a difference between language that we use, especially here in the US, on different data collection forms or different documentation that we may have to do in our profession, and the actual terms that individuals prefer to use. And we'll kind of continue to talk about that idea throughout today as well. There needs to be an awareness of the very vital importance of different terms that individuals prefer for themselves. But sometimes, unfortunately, at the end of the day, perhaps some documents simply do not reflect the terminology that an individual may prefer. So what that means is that a professional worker, kind of being in the middle of that situation, may have to play a little bit of translation and kind of team up with the individual and figure out how best they want to identify themselves according to the boxes that are given. So sometimes those situations can be a little bit tricky. Now, before moving on to specific vocabulary that will be new in this episode and working with the Latino or the Hispanic community, I want to revisit a couple of terms from the first webinar episode on this versus that, simply because they're very important to have ironed out in this discussion as well. I'm not going to dig as deep into these terms because the first webinar episode, I did take some more time on that. So if you would like to, I would encourage you after viewing this webinar to maybe go back and view that one if you have not in the past. So the first difference in terms that I want to point out before moving on to some new terminology for this episode is the difference between a stereotype and a generalization. This is incredibly important because anytime that we talk about looking at populations as a whole or looking at communities as a whole, we have to talk in generalizations while still continuing to constantly reinforce that there are, of course, individual differences within populations or within communities. That's different than talking or acting in a way towards populations in a stereotypical manner. So what is the difference between a stereotype and a generalization? Well, a stereotype is a very rigid, hard-line belief that someone may have about the way that members of a certain population act, value, talk, behave, every which way. And a stereotype oftentimes is not supported by actual sociological evidence or research. Oftentimes it's just a held thought based on perhaps maybe some anecdotal information or even really no information at all. That someone assumes a belief about a member of a group simply because they are a member of that group. A stereotype is also not typically something that members of that population would uphold as being something that is properly descriptive of that population. It's typically a thought that comes from outside of the community and is an imposed thought on that community, about the community. As opposed to a generalization, which is a characteristic or a value set, ways of behaviors, ways that relationships are structured, and so on within a community that typically through research has shown to genuinely be true and that individuals within that community would say, yes, that is descriptive of the community of which I am a member. A generalization may not be true for every individual within that community, but even if a generalization is not true for an individual, that person would likely still agree. That happens to not be the case, the truth in my case, but most of the time, generally speaking, yes, for my community, that is true, that is a common value or behavior or way of speaking or whatever the generalization may be. And again, we have to talk in generalizations when we're talking about working with different populations, while keeping in mind that every generalization, we must keep a grain of salt with that. Not all generalizations are going to be true for every single individual, and that just needs to be continually stated and understood as we do take a look at different populations. Race is a social construct that basically scientists a couple hundred years ago categorized the entire human population into different categories based only on physical characteristics, not based on language or tribal membership or religion or any piece of folks' identities, just based purely on the physical. Some scientists had a lot of different categories. Some scientists only had 3 or 4, and that 4 or 5 number is kind of what stuck around for a long time. Justified oppressive actions, justified slavery, justified colonialization, because not only did scientists categorize individuals based on physical characteristics, but they assigned values to those different categories. We now know that there's no biological foundation to race. Yes, there are physical characteristics that may be more common or non-existent or more existent across these racial lines, but those racial lines are very superficial, again, based only on the physical characteristics, and we're essentially made up and turn out to not be very scientific at all. However, what is a true consequence of that action of categorizing humans and ranking their value is we very much still today have lasting consequences from those oppressive actions. Again, genocide, slavery, mass rapes, colonialization, relocation, based on race. That is true, and that has lasting consequences on our communities to this day. So even though there's no biological truth to this idea or this concept of race, the treatment of human beings has been massively impacted over hundreds of years and has lasting consequences to this day. So that is the truth piece behind the racial issue. Now that's different. Race is different than ethnicity. Ethnicity does reflect more the person, whereas race was just based on physical characteristics alone. Ethnicity is, the ethnic group that someone would identify with. That's going to be a reflection oftentimes of their language, of their actual ancestry and nationality, though it doesn't have to be the same thing as nationality per se. It's going to be reflective, of as big of a group or as small scale of a group as the person identifies with. So in the US, Dutch Amish people, for example, that would be a very separate ethnic group from Afro-Latinos from Puerto Rico, would be a very different ethnic group than Irish Americans would be a different ethnic group. African Americans whose ancestors came to the US through the slave trade versus African Americans who recently immigrated from the Caribbean or their parents immigrated from the Caribbean. Those are all very, very distinct, different ethnic groups. And as you can see kind of displayed from the pictures here, the point of those pictures is that you can see some of that cultural heritage and ethnic heritage being expressed in these pictures, as opposed to the pictures meant to represent race is based very, very much only on the physical characteristics. So where does this come into play with the Latino or the Hispanic community? And we'll get to some of those terms in a second. The U.S. Construct of race and ethnicity, it's very funky. And part of the reason for that is because of what I just described about, the background of where race came from and our ideas of what racial lines exactly are and how those have perpetuated throughout the years and led to different laws and policies and procedures and discriminatory practices. Trying as a country to recover from that, or be at a place now where we're recognizing, health disparities, for example, that have come about from these years of oppression, and as a society taking a look at these different categories. The U.S. government doesn't, in different data collection methods, really recognize all the different ethnic groups that exist within the country. And a part of that is because it would be an endless list, really. One ethnic group that is recognized is the Hispanic or the Latino, and again, we'll talk about those specific terms in a minute, group. That data does get collected, but that is considered an ethnicity, not a race. And so individuals who they themselves are Hispanic or Latino would mark separately race from ethnicity. So like an example I gave a little bit ago, Afro-Latino from Puerto Rico, if they were to immigrate to the US, they may identify their race as being Black and their ethnicity as being Hispanic. Another example I gave of, an Irish American in the US, their race would be white, and they would just put non-Hispanic as far as their ethnicity goes. There's not really other opportunities to express ethnic groups. Now, the Latino or Hispanic community is a very, very large, very diverse, has a lot of variety within it. So even that as one large ethnic group doesn't necessarily get to, the details of the person. But we'll get to that as well. So there are a lot of different ways that Latino or Hispanic individuals can identify themselves, and different kind of identifying labels that may be preferred. Typically, again, in the US, we hear the words Latino or we hear the words Hispanic, but there are a lot of other ways that individuals may prefer to identify themselves. Getting back to what I was mentioning before, sometimes having to kind of be like the translator or go between what documents say and how an individual identifies. So real quickly, I'm going to describe the differences between some of these more common terms that we may come across, especially here in Texas. The first big one being the difference between Hispanic and Latino. And before I get into this, let me say that for all of these terms, there's like the textbook, like squeaky clean kind of story behind it, and oftentimes there may be another story behind a preferred term that may involve some politics, may involve some acknowledgement of a history of oppression or reclaiming identity words out of repression or oppression. So there's kind of those two different versions to every story. So first of all, Latino versus Hispanic. The kind of textbook difference between these two is Hispanic is talking about Spanish-speaking countries. So that includes much of South America and Central America, but it does exclude Brazil, because in Brazil they speak Portuguese. And this also includes Spain. This is really a term that is paying homage to the Spanish ancestry for this people group, or at least Spanish influence for this people group. It goes back to Spanish as the language that we're talking about here. Versus Latino is talking about being from Latin America. So for Latino, we get rid of Spain, because though they speak Spanish, that's not part of Latin America, and that's what we're talking about here. We bring back in Brazil. And honestly, depending on who you ask, certain countries in the Caribbean would be included, certain countries not. There's a little bit of debate. Certainly the Dominican Republic would be included in this. There's a little bit of debate about like French-speaking countries, whether or not those are included, or countries where colonization actually came from the Netherlands. Is that considered part of Latin America? That's not even a Latin, speaking or romantic language. Dutch is not. So some countries, there's a little bit of debate about whether or not it's actually considered Latin America, but by and large, Latino would be Central America, South America, and much of the Caribbean as well. That's the textbook version of the difference between the two. There's deeper reasons behind why someone may prefer one term over the other. So I'll explain that in just a second. Some folks honestly don't really care whether it's the term Hispanic or Latino, and if they tend to use one more than the other, it's just a matter of they've heard that word more often. Growing up in their community, that's the term that was used. Everyone says Latino, or everyone says Hispanic, and it's not necessarily, it's a big deal that's part of their identity, certainly, but between the two words, they may not necessarily have a huge opinion about that. For others, it's incredibly important. And if they state, I am Hispanic, and if they correct you, if you use a different term, or vice versa, if they correct you and say I'm Latino, that really, really needs to be acknowledged and respected. So from the Hispanic side, folks who may very strongly prefer the word Hispanic to describe themselves, again, that's paying homage to Spain. And that's an important piece of their identity. Speaking in generalizations here, again, this is not going to be true across the board, but many Cubans and Cuban Americans find it very important to pay that homage to Spain. Now, within the Latino or Hispanic community, there can be debates about reasons for that and so on and so forth, which we're not going to get into here today. But that's to say that for some folks, using the word Hispanic is important. For some folks, the word Latino is important because the term Hispanic was actually really coined by the US government in like the early 1970s to kind of describe Spanish-speaking countries and kind of clump them together to try to track different outcomes. And so the combination of it being really, really coined by the US government and it paying homage to Spain with the conquistadors and colonizers, that is not a term that some folks want to use to identify themselves. They do not want to identify as Hispanic, they want to identify as Latino. And that's very important. This is not the same as a coworker named Catherine getting upset if you shorten her name to Kate. Of course, people's names are important too, and names can also be very, very closely tied to the very identity of individuals. But this is not the same. This is very much a preference when it exists, which again, not all individuals within this community do have a preference, but if they do, it's very, very deeply rooted and into the core and essence of who that person is. And oftentimes to that individual, if you cannot respect that and you cannot understand that, then you can't come side by side with them and work on something or assist them in their life goals or assist them in a healing process. So this is a very, very big deal. You can certainly, accidentally use the wrong term and kind of not know which one is preferred to begin with. But once you do know that there is a preference, it's very important to honor that. Real quick, I'm going to touch on just a couple of other terms here that you may hear specifically in Texas. We're not going to go over all these. And I should also say that not all terms that you may come across that folks prefer to identify themselves may be on the screen here. This is literally just a few off of the top of my head. But another one I want to talk about is Latinx. That one is kind of up and coming amongst like activist groups and grassroots groups. Latinx actually is a word that kind of started to gain speed a little bit in the early 1990s, and then in the last couple years has had another little bit of a resurgence. The idea behind this word is that it is gender inclusive. In the Spanish language, nouns are either male or masculine, or they're feminine. And Latinx, by putting the X instead of a for Latina, or an O for Latino, that lets someone say, I'm Latinx, without a gender included in that. So a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's meant to kind of be an answer to machismo, which is something we're going to talk about today as well, as a bit of a feminist or a womanist piece to that movement. And it's also meant to be gender inclusive for folks who their gender does not fall on a binary spectrum. So folks who may be gender fluid, sometimes expressing themselves in a more masculine way and sometimes expressing themselves in a more feminine way, or gender non-conforming. They don't express their gender in a particularly masculine way or a particularly feminine way, and in general, just across the board. Latinx is a word that is definitely more common, like I said before, amongst like activist groups, as well as the younger generation. Definitely going to be more common amongst millennials than it is, baby boomers, for example. But it is a word that you may come across. And again, if someone identifies themselves as Latinx, then that's incredibly important to acknowledge that and honor that and refer to them in that way whenever it's appropriate. However, Latinx is not necessarily a word that all individuals are going to embrace within this community. Some folks do not like this term because they feel that it is an affront to the Spanish language, having that X in there and kind of taking away the original language, basically, with the gender piece is a piece of the Spanish language that should not be messed with, essentially. So you're definitely going to have varying opinions on that term. And then one last one that I want to talk about is the term Chicano. So Chicano is specifically in regards to individuals who are Mexican American or of Mexican descent. And typically, it's not necessarily a rule, but typically would have quite a bit of indigenous heritage. Excuse me, I didn't mean to go on. Chicano came out of an indigenous Mexican word, and in the early 1900s, and then especially in like the 1940s, 1950s, when Mexican Americans in the U.S. across multiple states, Texas, California, New Mexico, Colorado, started to really join the civil rights movement for their own cause as a community of Mexican Americans. And this impacted other Latinos and Hispanics in the country as well, but this was really a movement out of the Mexican American civil rights movement. This was a term that was really reclaimed, and a lot of individuals very, very staunchly want to be considered Chicano, to pay homage to their indigenous roots in Mexico, as opposed to using the term Hispanic or using the term Latino. So to this day, there are definitely folks who, if you ask them how they identify as Chicano. That is who they are. And again, that's very, very rooted at a deep level to their identity. Chicano is not quite as common of a term with the younger generation. It seems like Latinx is kind of coming out as being this younger generation's Chicano, so to speak. Although Latinx goes for other groups as well besides Mexican Americans. So I just wanted to touch on those different points. And again, the main point here is it's important. It's not just swapping out these terms for a lot of people. For some people, it's okay to swap out the terms. Some individuals do not mind if you say Hispanic or you say Latino. Both are perfectly fine. But if you're working with someone and in your interactions with them, you realize that they do have a strong preference, first of all, please use the term that they prefer. And second of all, there might be some need for more conversation there. That might be a good opportunity to have some good conversations that get at the root of what's important to this person, maybe some of the experiences of this person their worldview, some traumas that they have experienced or their family has experienced. It's really something to pay attention to and tap into instead of just like, oh, okay, this word type of a thing. Because again, it's not analogous to preferring Catherine instead of Kate. It is much deeper. So a couple of terms that are also important to understand, and this is getting to a couple of different issues that we see here in Texas. So there's enculturation and there's acculturation. And the reason that I talk about this with the Latino or with the Hispanic community is because there are two different ways that enculturation and acculturation affect this community here in Texas. So first of all, we of course may have an immigrant community where enculturation, I'll explain what those are in a minute, affect the cultural identity of immigrants who are coming into Texas. We also have, from the Mexican-American War, folks who the border jumped over them. So we have Mexican families that lived in the land for generations and generations, hundreds of years, and then after a war, the border jumped over them, and they were all of a sudden strangers in their own land, and no longer the quote-unquote dominant culture within the land where they own land and they own farms and they own ranches. So those are the two different ways that this can affect the community as we know it here in Texas today. So first of all, enculturation is the process that you go through of learning your own culture. So as you're being raised, and we can see we have a picture of a lovely young girl here, maybe learning to cook from her mother and grandmother potentially. It is day in and day out throughout your life. You are just absorbed constantly by your own culture. That's enculturation. It's the amount that you are exposed to the culture of your own group, okay? Now, some people may be enculturated quite a bit, and some people may be enculturated to a lesser extent. So for example, let's just say that someone is adopted out of their family at age 5 into a different cultural group. They would have from age 0 to 5 been enculturated within one culture, and then age 5 on been enculturated by a different culture, or even gone through the process of acculturation, which is taking on cultural messages, cultural values, cultural norms, so to speak, of a different culture than yourself. And oftentimes when we see this happen, we see a minority group within a larger society, that the larger society is not reflective of the cultural norms of that minority group, has to go through the acculturation process to assimilate, so to speak. So TV is not necessarily the end all and be all of acculturation, but I just wanted to use this to just kind of show that it is messages or cultural values or norms that are coming from outside, that are from a different cultural group, and that the person may take on those behaviors or change in some way to essentially fit into that culture. And so again, that's important in the context of the state of Texas in two different ways with this population. Most Latino or Hispanic folks who we have in the state are descendants of one or the other, either immigrants who crossed over the border with Mexico sometime after the Mexican-American War, or they're descendants of folks who were already here living on the land, and then as a result of that war became strangers in their own land. And all of a sudden it was a new language, new laws, new norms, where they were now the minority there. Moving on, we want to kind of take a little look at cultural self. I know I've used the term cultural identity a whole lot, and I wanted to show a model that shows And again, we're talking in generalizations here. This is not certainly going to be true for all Hispanic or Latinx individuals, but this is to kind of show the construct of self-identity, of cultural identity of individuals within this group, okay? So as you can see, in general terms, and with this, again, we need to take into account and remember what I was just talking about with acculturation and enculturation. Someone who was highly enculturated into Hispanic culture will probably be more likely to reflect this in the way that they see themselves and the way they see their personal identity. Someone who has been acculturated into kind of U.S. Anglo-Saxon framework may reflect this to a certain extent, but not quite as much. So you can see here, and I'm going to make a comparison between this cultural self diagram and an Anglo-American cultural self diagram. You can see that here, speaking in general terms to Hispanic or Latinx individuals, La casa, or like the home and your immediate nuclear family, is the nucleus. It is the core. That is everything, right? La familia, extended family, very, very close friends through cuatismo. Those are like very, very close friends who are like family. You may call them your sister, may call them your brother. Moving on to aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins. Moving on to comadres and compadres through the godparents. That is like the nucleus of the life of, like, in general terms, a Latino individual. And comparing that, I'm going to move ahead a couple slides for this, to the cultural self of an Anglo-American. The nucleus here for an Anglo-American's construct is themselves. And then there's these other values that family, children, norms, friends, spirituality, and religion that are certainly important pieces to the individual, but they're compartmentalized outside of the self. And if you think about our mental health system, the reason that I show the Anglo-American construct is because this is the framework through which many, really all of our systems were created in the US, is through this framework of emphasizing the individual and emphasizing the self. It's that whole idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's the idea of, in mental health, when we're talking about working with transition age youth, moving them towards independence, moving them towards self-efficacy. Those are very, very oftentimes the goals. Or even with adults, moving them to a place within the world where they can stand on their own and they don't necessarily need others. To an according to an Anglo-American framework, that's how you have healthy relationships, is you are your own whole person by yourself, and then from there you can interact with the world and other individuals in a healthy manner. And if that's not what is going on, then you probably have a dependence problem upon others. That's the Anglo-American framework, as compared to, going back again, the Hispanic or Latinx framework, which is very, very different. Here, if you don't have your familia, if you are not integrated into this network in a very, very deep and significant way, then that's being out of balance. And that's being out of touch with your true cultural self. You can't separate the individual out from the family. And so think about implications that this can have with our families if our treatment planning and our diagnostic procedures and our engagement and our outreach is focused on the holistic health of just the individual in a vacuum, because through the Anglo-American framework, that's how you are healthy to then engage with others. That may not always translate very well into families where it's like, hey, the situation is not just about my son, or the situation is not just about my sister. This is a family situation, right? Because to the core of the person and their cultural self is their family, okay? And again, I know I keep saying this, but it is so important to keep in mind that we're talking in generalizations here. So through the acculturation process, you may have some individuals, especially if it's folks who their family's been in the U.S. for generations and generations, there's still likely going to be some level of this cultural self diagram going on, but combined to some extent with the Anglo-American framework, simply because, again, our systems are constructed in this way. So to really engage with different systems as a person living in the U.S., you oftentimes do have to adapt, at least to some extent, to this type of framework. Now, from the Hispanic or Latinx framework, we can see a number of different cultural values that I'm going to move through fairly quickly here. Because of the cultural self framework that is common within this community, we see that the Latino community is very much a collectivistic culture versus individualistic. There are obviously differences between individuals, and individual differences are celebrated and honored. This is not to say that individualism doesn't exist to any extent, but the culture is much more collectivistic. Relationships matter, incredibly so. Familismo is the cultural value of the importance of the family. Again, family is like at the center of everything. Machismo is the concept that men are authority figures. Marianismo is the concept that women are to be kind of like dedicated, loyal wives. And this also blends into an idea of being very dedicated, loyal mothers. And sometimes this machismo, Marianismo from an Anglo-American construct can kind of get a bad rap. But this is really just kind of a conservative way of having a family structured. Sometimes from an Anglo-American framework, this can seem like it automatically is always going to lead to like abuse or something like that, and that's simply not the case. This is just a way of having gender roles that are common within the community. Of course, if machismo goes too far, it can become an issue, but this is just a typical way that a lot of traditional families are structured. There's also the idea of fatalismo, which is talking about the power of fate. This is a really big resilience factor within the Latinx community, because it's basically fatalism, where at the end of the day, you can only do so much, and at a certain extent, things may be out of your hand, and certain powers that be are going to be what come up with the end result. The reason I say that this can be a resiliency factor is, especially given sometimes some history of, not some history, a lot of history of oppression and abuses from others, this is a coping strategy that definitely has lended to a lot of resilience in the community, where we see some better outcomes than could sometimes be expected as far as health outcomes for this population, given a lot of past trauma that does take place. Versus typically Anglo-Americans do not hold as much to this fatalismo because of the emphasis of the self as kind of like the nucleus of your identity. So if something is going wrong in the life of someone who is more using an Anglo-American framework, they need to do something about it. They have power and control over that, and that can be very stressful if they keep trying and nothing changes. They're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Versus someone who adheres to fatalismo, they recognize that some things are out of the control of a specific individual. Next, there's the idea of simpatía or personalismo. This is the importance of kindness. Very, very important. And this is different than the importance of informal chit-chat in the beginning of a session or of an interaction with a client. Simpatía and personalismo, those are talking about, even in stressful times, because of the importance of human relationships, you need to keep that connection. You can try to speed up the conversation a little bit, but you should remain kind, you should remain polite, you should remain as if this person you're talking to or this family you're interacting with, they're the only ones in the world that you're with, type of a thing. That relationship is way more important than getting to the next, whatever you have in your agenda on time, type of a thing. So that's incredibly important to keep in mind as well. And then the last cultural value I want to go over is respeto. That's respect according to a hierarchy. So oftentimes a lot of members of this population, again, talking in general terms, and it depends on the level of acculturation here, will believe very strongly in respect according to a hierarchy within the home, within the family, and within the larger community. And so oftentimes combining respeto with machismo, you may see sometimes in families that the eldest male is to make the final decisions on major decisions within the family. That can be something that, for folks who aren't familiar with this respeto machismo situation, can seem different or strange, especially again if you're looking at the individual in the framework of the individual is the epicenter of everything. We may be working with a family where la familia, the family, is everything, and there's this hierarchy structure that's in place. And so when we're talking about outreach to families, treatment planning with families, engagement in general with families, decision-making points that may have to happen when we're working with an individual, when we're working with one child or with one teenager, that child, that teenager is not the epicenter of that treatment, because that child, that teenager is not the epicenter of that family, if you're working with a family where this structure is what rings true. Now, I do want to leave time for some questions. Looks like we just have a few minutes left, but I want to touch very, very briefly, and I'll go very quickly on a couple of other things really quick. So first of all, there are different explanatory models, and explanatory models are essentially how one explains causes of illnesses as well as treatment approaches for illnesses. And so I'm just going to go over this really, really quickly to explain that there are different frameworks for health, for wellness, for illnesses. There's naturalistic causes, and there's also personalistic causes, okay? Naturalistic causes, this will include like the Western medicine's medicinal model, as well as some other models, but this is essentially where natural forces of one way or another are what is causing the illness. So a virus causing an illness, or an imbalance of hot and cold within the body, or a hormonal imbalance within the body. Those are different naturalistic causes. And a lot of times it's assumed when we're interacting with families that that is how a family thinks about illness. But sometimes there can be frameworks or explanatory models of personalistic. This is where illnesses are caused by an interaction with another being. It could be caused by another human. It can be caused by a deity or spiritual force. Typically, it does involve spirituality or supernatural forces. And typically, treatment requires assistance by a traditional healer. So it's incredibly important to know what folks you are working with, what they believe could be some root causes of the situations they're going through. Because if they believe that a personalistic cause may be at play, and you're speaking from naturalistic terms, specifically Western medicinal terms, then there can be a lot of cross-communication there. And then lastly, real quick, please go ahead and feel free to start putting questions in the chat box if you happen to have any. But one last thing I want to touch on is the importance of understanding historical trauma. And not only historical trauma as a concept in general, but also learning the specific historical traumas that your families you're working with may have gone through. So historical trauma, hopefully that we're all on the call familiar, at least to some extent, with trauma, with post-traumatic stress disorder, with childhood trauma, all of that. Trauma can actually be transmitted throughout the generations. And historical trauma is when there's a large-scale community trauma that then is transmitted throughout the generations, throughout the entire community. So this has been observed in descendants of survivors of the Holocaust. This has been observed in descendants of survivors of different plagues or different winters when a population went without food and many people died. This has been observed in the American Indian community. This has been definitely observed in some Latino communities as well. I want to read this quote here. Historical trauma is entirely different than consciously holding on to the past when it resides in your ancestral memory and DNA. It results in numerous defense mechanisms, developmental malfunctions, and behavioral issues. This is scientific and supported in studies. And so what essentially happens is, due to the trauma response of cortisol levels and stress hormones being out of balance in the individual members of a community that underwent a mass trauma, such as genocide, such as relocation, such as mass rapes, mass murders, things along those lines, those trauma responses actually do get transmitted, and the genes that are expressed changes throughout the generations. And so this is potentially an issue that it's very important to be aware of, that could be affecting your families. And again, there's not one historical trauma I can point to that has definitively affected every single individual of this group, because the population is so large and expansive and there's so much variety. But it's incredibly important to know the history of the families that you're working with, and understand that the past could potentially be having an impact on what's going on now. And again, if we're focusing just on individuals here and now, if we have a 10-year-old who's displaying certain behavioral issues and we're just looking at that 10-year-old in a vacuum, not having the full picture of the family, the full picture of the community, the full picture of past and of ancestry, then we're probably going to miss some very, very important elements to coming alongside this family in the healing process. So I talked a little bit longer than I had intended to. It doesn't look like we have any questions yet, but I do want to go ahead and open it up for questions. So if you do have any, please go ahead and utilize that chat box. This can be further clarification on some terms that I said, or if you have a different viewpoint on any of the kind of explanations or clarifications that I've provided. I think we have a few more minutes if anyone has anything of that. So there's a question from Marco. I do have one question returning the term respeto. Is that the actual term? I believe so, and please, someone feel free to call me out if I make any error during this. But yes, respeto would be the term that's used to signify the importance of respect as a cultural value in the community. Well, if there are any other follow-up questions or comments or requests for future topics for this webinar series, anything at all, I'm also more than happy and open to have some continued conversations, provide some continued clarifications. If anything I said today was confusing or you'd like to learn more about it, I'm very open to that. So please just send me an email if you want any of that. Also for your organization, if you want any tailored trainings or specific information, assistance on how to evaluate for healthcare disparities by race and ethnicity, anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me, and we can certainly have a conversation and see how we might be able to collaborate. But thank you everyone so much for taking your time this morning to join us. I hope that it was helpful and beneficial. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you.